Welcome to tonight's conversation between Adam Phillips and Andrew Miller. My name is David Russell, and I'm a fellow of the Society of Fellows in the Humanities here at Columbia University. And it's my great privilege to introduce to you this evening Andrew Miller and Adam Phillips, two writers whom I admire a great deal. It's a rather daunting privilege too. And when I, slightly querulously, I fear, wrote to a friend in England to express how difficult it seemed to do justice to two such impressive thinkers, given a formal introduction's function and time constraints, and this will last no more than 5 minutes, he helpfully responded, "Just say you're a huge fan and get done with it." So that's basically what I'm going to do. But more specifically, I thought I'll just offer just a few hints at some connections between certain themes and preoccupations, as I see them, of Miller's and Phillips' work when considered together. And I'll begin with the simple observation that both Miller and Phillips are essayistic writers, and in the essayistic tradition of Montaigne or Emerson or Charles Lamb, for example. They write speculatively and experimentally about what being a person in the world feels like, about what it's like to live with other people, and also about what are the possible resources of culture to be found, among other places in philosophy and psychoanalysis and literature, that might inform and inspirit our sociable lives. In fact, the description that first came to mind when thinking about Phillips and Miller together is that they are encouraging writers. They're interested in what it is that keeps us moving, what keeps our appetites for life alive, or what informs what we might understand as a sense of improvement, of how we could ever even talk about things getting better. One of the things that makes the work of both these writers so valuable, I think, is that they're able to take up, without sentimentality or nostalgia or any coercive doctrine, the question of how it is that people, in Auden's great line about Freud, can become able to approach the future as a friend. As literary critics, Miller and Phillips write about the relationship of literature to life and the possible effects of literature on life, which isn't something critics always do. And they are particularly interested, I think, in the examples by which literature produces these effects, and with what kind of example literature is to us. And I'll conclude this very brief reflection by noting that, in particular, the kind of example to us with which both Miller and Phillips have recently been concerned is that of the unlived life, of lives that we feel we might have had but haven't, and about which literature helps us to think. Their work shares at this juncture a tactful and subtle appreciation of the relations between exemplarity and specificity, and between the possibilities of the virtual and the necessary resistances of social mediation. Both writers focus on the question of what it is like to have a life, and this specific life now, and the ways in which literature, philosophy, and psychoanalysis all respond to this question. And that's the opening reflections, and now I'm going to do the formal bit and give you brief resumes of the two thinkers you're about to hear from in conversation. Andrew Miller is a professor of English and director of the Victorian Studies program at Indiana University in Bloomington, and is editor of the journal Victorian Studies. He has been the recipient of fellowships from the National Humanities Center, the Indiana University Arts and Humanities Institute, and the American Council of Learned Societies. Miller is the author of two books, Novels Behind Plate Glass, Commodity Culture and Victorian Narrative in 1995, and The Burdens of Perfection, on Ethics and Reading in 19th Century Literature, which was published in 2008. Miller's recent article, entitled Lives Unled in Realist Fiction, which appeared in the journal Representations, was the winner of the North American Victorian Studies Association 2008 Donald J. Gray Award for the best essay published in the field of Victorian studies. He's currently working on a book project called On Not Being Someone Else. Adam Phillips is a practicing psychotherapist, literary critic, and essayist. He's a regular contributor to the London Review of Books, The Observer, and the New York Times. His works include Winnicott in 1998, On Kissing, Tickling, and Being Bored in 1993, Monogamy in 1996, Darwin's Worms in 1999, Promises 2000, Going Sane 2005, Side Effects 2007, Intimacies, which was co-authored with Leo Bassani in 2008, On Kindness, co-authored with Barbara Taylor in 2009, On Balance in 2010, and most recently, his book Missing Out, in Praise of the Unlived Life, which has just come out here. Phillips is working on a biography of Sigmund Freud, and he is the general editor of the New Penguin translation of Freud's complete works. And I can't forbear to add that his generosity has made all the difference to my life. Please join me in welcoming Adam Phillips and Andrew Miller.
Thank you, David. I'd also like to thank the Center for making it possible for Adam to be here, and their staff, and Eileen Goluli in particular. Adam and I thought we would start by talking about missing out, and then move from that to talk about other preoccupations and interests as the conversation takes us, before then turning things over to you for your questions and comments. And I thought I'd start this way, Adam, predictably, I suppose, with Neil Diamond. There's a story about Neil Diamond, I think an interview in The Guardian. He was asked whether being rich, what difference being rich had made for him. And he said, and I think the fantasy behind the question was, being rich will give you a life that's entirely full. All your needs, all your desires, all your satisfactions will be met, and it will brim not just to the lip of your cup, but slightly over. And Diamond said, well, he had nothing to complain about, but that really money hadn't made a difference. He said, you can only spend so much money. What am I going to do? Eat another lunch? And your book is about many things. It's about satisfaction and frustration. It's about specialness and how important it is to feel special if you were then going to acknowledge your lack of specialness. It's about the dreams of omniscience and the importance of naivete. But it really starts by being about having one lunch. This lunch cooling on its plate in front of you. Not the lunch that other people at your table are eating, not the lunches you've read about, but this one lunch. And it's a familiar image, I think, of our life as having a beginning and end, our mortality. You've got this life and no life to come. But you're not interested in that so much, but you're interested in the fact that we've got one life now and none other right now, that we're limited now by our singularity, say, by the fact that each of us is single. And that's on the one hand, that's an everyday thought, it seems to me. It's familiar enough. You feel envy at somebody else, what he or she has ordered at lunch, say, or in larger terms, the luck or path that another person's taken. But it can also be a quite mad thought. Browning somewhere says, I think in Andrea del Sarto says, had I been but two, another and myself, our head would have o'erlooked the world, which is grotesque and crazy, but also every day at the same time. And that seems to me that's a place that you are, as a writer, naturally at home, where the everyday and the extreme flip-flop and are cohabit. True or false?
True.
Good. Question 2.
Do you want to say anything else?
No, I'm done.
I think it is interesting, this question of one's one life and no other, because it's true of the past in one sense, but it isn't true of the future. That is to say, one doesn't know what one might be capable of or what possibilities might be in the future for one's life. And the Neil Diamond thing about you can't have two lunches is very interesting in a way, because of course you can have two lunches. Mm. But were you to have two lunches, the risk would be that either you would lose your appetite, or that, in a sense, you'd go off the idea of lunch altogether. Mm. And in a way, the book starts with that question, I think. It starts with the psychoanalytic version of this story, which is a as a child, let's say, but obviously as an adult, you begin by fantasizing. Out of your need, you begin fantasizing what you might want. And then something specific actually arrives, if you're lucky enough. And the question then is what you can make of what you're given. Because obviously you can't make what you're given. And in a way, everything hangs on that fact. Everything hangs on the fact of you want something, ideally will be provided. And then everything depends on what you can make of that and how it is offered to you. And it's as though lives proliferate from that basic state. Because reactive to what you actually get, you can obviously refuse it, you can attack it, you can enjoy it, you can do a whole lot of things. But you're always going to be dealing with the disparity between what's wanted and what actually is available. And that seems to be the basic story that the book starts with. How many lives you can make out of the one life you in fact have, or how many meals you can make out of the one lunch you have. Whether you can keep it delicious, or whether actually you have to sort of kill it.
Much of your, when you write in the book, much of your attention's paid on our desire for better lives, so our frustration at not having another life. But that's not always the way it works, right? I mean, sometimes you think, oh God, well, there but for the grace of God go I, right? I mean, I could have made this other decision, I could have made this other life for myself, and that would have been a much worse life. But we don't think about that as much, I don't think.
No, except in our kind of triumphalist moments, presumably. I mean, what's interesting, I think, is that it's impossible to imagine one's life without comparisons with other lives.
Yes.
That the two things are sort of inextricable. And that when we're thinking about, and presumably this is one reason why, say, in literature, people read or read biographies, to see what a life looked like, in as much as you could see it, as it were, fictionally. But when you're thinking about other lives, you're presumably all the time, when you're thinking of a better life, you're thinking of your version of a life of more complete satisfaction, let's say. So think Hazlitt says, about when we're admiring somebody else, we're imagining ourselves as them, not being them. Right. And that seems to be right. I think it also must be true, and this must be true initially among siblings, presumably, that somewhere there is a question always, who's having the better life? Who's getting more of the goodies? Given there's a basic scarcity in the family, there's only one mother and father and so on, the child's always wondering who's getting the better bit, who's getting the most, and who's getting the things he's deprived of. And that must be one of the sources of this question of invidious comparison between lives. Because somebody always is getting more pleasure than we are. And hopefully somebody always is getting less pleasure than we are. And we're all those people in that imagining.
All right. Hazlitt says, there's one exception, right? I mean, he says, I would be anything. I would be a toad in the garden to be the person who my loved person loves. That's the one exception that he has. But thinking about siblings, right, that what are the factories, or what are the factories that generate this invidious, or this comparison, sometimes invidious, sometimes not. Woolf says in her diaries someplace, no, for God's sake, don't compare, like it's this incubus that settled on her. And one of those places is sibling relations, where you have this, there you are, the only one, and then another one comes and is in exactly your place structurally, is close, very close to your place structurally, and yet has this different fate from you. But that's not the only place where it's generated. I mean, there are, we think typically about marriage, I think, about career choice. The range are the other lives we have fall into patterns. So sibling relations is one, marriage another, career choice. It's not random, the lives that we don't lead. There's I want to read some of you back to yourself, because you mentioned children, siblings. And I guess my question is, this is from Sameness is All. So not from this book, from an earlier book promises. And I guess all I want to know is how you think about this passage in relation to what you've been thinking about in Missing Out. And excuse the length of this, but it's an extraordinary piece of writing, I think. An 8-year-old girl who has referred to me for school phobia that had begun a year after her sister was born told me in her second session that when she grew up, she was going to do clothing. I said, make clothes for people? And she said, no, clothing, you know, when you make everyone wear the same uniform, like the headmistress does. We learned about it in biology. I said, if everyone wears the same uniform, no one's special. She thought about this for a moment and then said, yes, no one's special, but everyone's safe. I was thinking then, though I couldn't find a way of saying it, that if everyone was the same, then there would be no envy. But she interrupted my thoughts by saying, the teacher told us that when you do clothing, you don't need a mummy and daddy, you just need a scientist, a man. It's like twins. All the babies are the same. There was so much in all this that I couldn't choose which bit to pick up. I could only apparently carry on with the conversation. I said, if your sister was exactly the same as you, maybe you could go to school. And she said, yes, with some relish. I could be at home and school at the same time. Everything. So I read this passage to a collection of graduate students in a class, and after they were done shaking their heads, one person said, I want to be a child psychologist. Right? This is a person who has a fantasy of having two lives, right? I mean, or a fantasy of a community of two, where they are the same. So how does that, the extraordinary riches that are in this passage, how do they work with the desires for other lives?
Well, when you gave your list of the ways in which you might think about this, and you said siblings, marriage, I was thinking, obviously, of one's relationship to one's parents. I'm sorry to be psychoanalytic about this in a certain way.
I think you're entitled.
But it seems to me that the first version of this thing we're talking about must happen in relation to the parents. Along the lines of, first of all, there are two other lives that one begins with, even if there's an absent father. There's somewhere a father that's known about at some level. So you've come into a world in which there are two other people. So there's already two lives, and there are two sexes, let's say, even if it takes time to apprehend that. And you know certain things, like, if you're lucky, you know, for example, that your mother adores you, but she goes to bed every night with your father, and same with your father. You also know things like they do things together from which you are inevitably excluded. So you know there is another world, and of course things like your mother and father might go off to work, say, if they work. So they inhabit other worlds, but they're supposed to be, at least nominally, organized around your needs. So immediately there are proliferating worlds here. There's a very interesting Hungarian-French analyst called Grumberger, who said that the thing about the Oedipus complex was that it wasn't that the father forbid the son to sleep with the mother for those kind of murderous reasons, but that in fact, in stopping the son sleeping with the mother, the father is protecting the son's future life, because were the son to be allowed to sleep with the mother, he would be unable to have sex with her. He would be physiologically incapable. So in other words, the boy doesn't have the wherewithal to fulfill his wishes. So here, immediately, there are, as it were, three lives, potentially. There's the child imagining being the mother and the father, and the child imagining being himself, and himself in relation to all these. So that when the father stops, in this cliché, the father stops the son sleeping with the mother, the father is saying to the son, in some way, I can do something you can't. You may be able to do this in the future, but it won't be this. And out of that, a lot of different imaginings, it seems to me, proliferate. But one of them must be to do with what do I have to do to narrow the gap between myself as I experience myself and myself as I would like to be.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to be lots of other people then populate that space, if you see what I mean, as in they get closer or further away from being as I would like to be.
And you then hold on to those imaginings as other possibilities.
As kind of guardians of your future self. So that you're keeping alive the possibility that these things are possibilities.
So that's one of the things that the existence of other lives, that's one way that it matters for you, because it suggests the possibility for change, right? That you might, that there are other things that you might, other people that you might be or become.
And other things you might do in relation to being left out of the lives you think you want. So that on the one hand you could spend your whole life wishing you were at the party you weren't invited to.
Right.
Or you could think, well, I could do something else instead. In other words, it might be the predicament which actually inspires you to have other thoughts. Or it might leave you with a lifelong grudge. But at least those two options are available to you. And both of those options involve you imagining yourself as different from the way you are. Either you at the party, whoever you imagine you'd be at it, or you doing something else. You being less preoccupied by what you're left out of.
Right, so there's something to be relinquished in that second
Yeah.
instance.
Yeah. And that's the tyranny of being special, is that in the wish to be special, it's as though you have the magical fantasy that nothing need be relinquished.
So one thing I think about as you're saying this is has to do with possibility. There's the desire to have another life, to be at the party, say. And a great deal of literature, I think, represents and feeds on that desire, both in the sense that the author is creating, is writing out of that, and also we read out of the desire to stand in some relation to possible lives. Some authors this matters more than others. Larkin, who you quote a number of points here, this is something that he can't escape, I think. He has many poems. To My Wife, a terrible sonnet, and others. Or Hardy, who's extraordinarily inventive in imagining unhappy relations to lives unlived, or Woolf or Dickens. So there's some writers for whom this matters a lot. And Woolf is one of them, but I think for her, one of the things that I learned from reading both her diaries and also Mrs. Dalloway is that part of her investment is in the sense of possibility. So I'm thinking, say, Mrs. Dalloway, yes, there's another life that Clarissa could have lived. She could have married Peter. But a lot of the energy in that book lies in reimagining being a young adult. When you're no longer a child, it's not that the future is relatively formless, but you're not locked into wife, the role of wife. There are these visible roles out there, these people, in her case, you could marry. And the world was electric with those possibilities. And that sense of possibility, I think, is one of the things that motivates the investment in thinking about other lives. Not just the party you might be going to, but having all these choices.
But in a way, two things are electric, aren't they? One is the possibilities, and the other is sealing them up. Because
relinquishing them, giving them up.
Yes, or being relieved of the burden of them.
Yes.
I mean, there's a very interesting moment in, I don't know, I think it might be in Being and Nothings, I can't remember. It's a moment in Sartre talks about, and people may know this, the young couple. Every morning, they go down and have breakfast together. The man goes off to work, and the wife sits by the window crying all day. And when he comes back, she perks up. Sartre says, well, the obvious interpretation of this is that the woman is suffering from a separation anxiety, because actually she can't live really in his absence. But actually, Sartre says, really, this woman is suffering from a vertigo of freedom, because when her husband leaves, she can do anything she wants. And so the grief is, as it were, a cover story for the fact that she is imagining possibilities that tyrannize her or frighten her in some way. And I think that's like a sort of parable of this thing we're talking about. You know, it's about, like Tony Tanner said, I think, that all novels are about adultery. Well, I don't know if all novels are about adultery, but a lot of novels are about adultery. And that's presumably because they're about people feeling confined in a present predicament and needing to imagine another one.
Yes.
And what Sartre's talking about is the tyranny of that.
Mm-hmm. Right. So there are two possibilities there. If you think that seems a fair characterization of, call it, modern existence, where there's this reticulation of possibilities, and some of those possibilities may be foreclosed to us or closed off by our choice, some by chance. Things befall us, and we can have them. And we just offered two different descriptions of how one might inhabit that position. One is as electrifying possibility, and the other is as terrifying burden. So what determines that it be one rather than the other? Question mark. Or is that an unhelpful way? Is that too general a way to put it?
Well, no,
phrase the question?
well, in a way, it is the question, isn't it? I agree, but there must be so many conflicting factors in this. Because when you said it, I thought, well, one thing that doesn't determine it, but affects it, is the culture one grows up in.
Mm.
The one is being encouraged to think about one's life in certain kinds of ways. So if, for example, we're encouraged to think that our best selves are relatively autonomous, let's say, so that what defines us at our best is our capacity to make choices. Then obviously the question is, well, what in us is making the choices? How's it doing that? And the implicit assumption is that it's good to be able to make a choice. I would assume that insofar as the question could be answered, it would be a combination of two things. One would be who you happen to be, which could be called your genetic potential, your temperament, your character, could be called lots of things. But let's just say you're born with something. And then there is the environment that you're born into. And the environment you're born into is very, very selective. There are some things about you it loves, and some things about you it is discouraging you to be. And that's just ineluctable. That's always going to be the case. So parenting is a kind of aesthetic thing. It's about endorsing the beautiful, i.e. what it is about your child that gives you beautiful feelings, and dealing with the other bits that is troubling, to put it mildly. So there's that. And so the child is always struggling with, it's a bit like the thing you've begun with, that the child is struggling with what the parents want him to be, and they're not always conscious of that. That's an unconscious demand as well as a conscious one. And who the child feels himself to be. Because on the one hand, he's wanting to be what the parents want him to be, and he's wanting to cure them by being that. If you can be what your parents seem to want you to be, it's as though everybody's life will be better. And when you've done that, then you can have parents who will be available for you. So you get that job done, and then you'll have freedom. But for most people, there's a really powerful conflict between that desire, which is, I think, profound, and the other one, which is a life of one's own. Not untrammeled by the demands of others, but not absolutely confined by them. But then the child is very quickly in a difficult position, because there are clearly moments in childhood when it dawns on oneself as a child that there may be pleasures outside the family, things you really want that your parents can't provide you with. And at that moment, or in those cumulative moments, you have a real conflict on your hands, because you want things that the parents can't provide, but that potentially puts you out of their orbit. So it's as though it's a crisis of desire versus safety, and a disillusionment with the fact that the parents actually don't provide everything for you. And then you've got to do something. One thing you can do is retreat from those possibilities that the world offers, and but to live as if your parents, your family have everything you really need. Or you can think, actually, everything you need is in the world. It's outside the family circle. And there's an immediate split, if you like. Because once you stay in the family circle, the repertoire is narrowed very considerably.
But you started with autonomy and the importance of how the value placed on autonomy. And the story that you then told seemed to imagine the child as, to a certain degree, autonomous.
Well, autonomous in the sense the child is driven by desires, not exactly consciously making decisions in a supermarket, but being driven towards things, feeling a kind of tropism or an affinity with certain people, certain things, certain objects in the world, but being drawn away from the parents by desire or perception, all sorts of things, but also feeling the need to return to them.
So, desire, driven away from the parents by desire. Desire is fundamental for you. Is this true? You say desire or perception.
Well,
but really it's...
I don't know. I mean, the trouble with these words is nobody knows what they mean. I mean, and the word desire has so much glamour attached to it. You think, that's an exciting thing to be driven by. But there's clearly something, it feels as though there is something that, as it were, is impelling us. That we find ourselves drawn towards certain people, certain satisfactions, certain ethical objects. And what constitutes that drive might be complicated and controversial, but nevertheless, they do exist. We really do have preferences. And even if we don't know what the ground of the preference is, they really do exist.
So there are many things there. Driven towards ethical objects, but you're not characterizing the movement as one which is intrinsically, for instance, ethical in its nature. There's this drive which is prior. The word, yeah.
I mean, again, it seems to be so difficult to answer this question because I think two conflicting things. One is, I think the thing Tickling said is right, which is that what Freud is saying is there is a part of ourselves that actually can't possibly fit into the ethical demands of the culture. And that's, in a way, is the most valuable thing Freud says, is that we are acculturated very unhappily, and we need to stick to that. On the other hand, that thought is the product of a culture, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, it's recursive.
So, yes, exactly. So it doesn't seem to me as though there's an outside here. So that on the one hand, one might want to think there is a part of oneself that is ruthlessly amoral, that is just desire-driven. Whereas it seems to me to be much more likely the case that whatever the biological ground of this is, it is immediately enmeshed in the need to be lovable or acceptable. So there's always the question of whether I'm an acceptable or unacceptable person as the carrier, if you like, of this desire. So I don't think it's ever amoral, because it's always going on in a group of people. You're never in the world by yourself. So there's always an account going on of the effect of your actions on others.
So let me take that in a different direction. You said we have preferences. I'm interested in the question of value. In, I think, Darwin's Worms, you notice marginalia, and Darwin somewhere in the margins wrote, "Never say higher or lower," which is a wonderful thing to find. Do you say higher or lower?
I mean, when he says never say higher or lower, he's presumably putting that statement at the top, if you see what I mean. And I think you can't avoid that, but the question, I suppose, is what you're saying by saying that. Mm-hmm. Because there are certainly things I value more than others. And I would have, as everybody must have, consciously and unconsciously, a hierarchy of moral values. In other words, the things without which the things if one didn't abide by, one would feel one was betraying oneself.
Yes.
And it seems to me those are very, very strong.
Mm.
They may not be things we all agree on, but each person has a sense of what they are.
Mm. And the cost of not following them is self-betrayal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that being the worst betrayal.
Worse than betraying someone else.
It seems to me now, at this moment, yes, it is.
Yeah. So does that conception of how higher and lower works apply to aesthetic responses? One of the remarkable things about your books, of course, is that as someone who went to university training in literature, but then became someone who works as a psychotherapist, you've retained your immersion in the literary. You quote some things, but you don't quote other things. You don't quote everything. And why is that? how would you select among the things that you quote? Because some are better, because some are truer to who you, because they don't betray you?
I don't really know, but I think that two things occur to me. One is that there must be some, given how much I read, there must be a reason why some things stick. And I presume one is haunted by certain quotations, or goes on thinking about them or repeating them, because they are like dreams in the sense that they have something enigmatic but very pertinent to oneself in them. So one's always working over them, in a sense. But the more immediate experience is that they're incredibly pleasurable. There's something very pleasurable about reading them or saying them, and saying them to other people.
And does the pleasure come, typically for you, does the pleasure come, is it sensuous pleasure? Is it conceptual pleasure? No, it's sensuous pleasure.
It's both those things. I'm not sure I could distinguish those, but it would be definitely, it would be a, in the saying of them, and sometimes in the seeing of how people respond to them, it is intrinsically enlivening and alive-making. You feel, I feel, more part of something I want to be part of, insofar as those things are recognized. It's as though, if people, of course they're not jokes, but if people will laugh at this joke that I love, I've made a world that I want to live in. And if they don't, I could feel very, very estranged in that world. And it's similar with the quotations. Now, it's not that you want everybody to go, as though you're making a cult secretly, but I think I would like people who think they are at least interesting. There's something in this.
So that, as I said at the start, this book is about many things. Because of its title and its prologue, typically people focus on the fact that it's about unlived lives. But then, as is the case with your books generally, the essayistic movement means that you recur to issues and stray far and come back. One of the things that you also take up is getting it and not getting it. And in the essay on not getting it, you, in Missing Out, you imagine the value, what value there might be in being someone for whom, at a moment, not getting it was okay. Not where it is a joke or a poem or a person. That we would not be driven by the need to know or to understand. But see what other sorts of response there might be. I was at, so having read this and wanting to test it out, I went to Don Carlo last night, not solely with this purpose in mind, but didn't turn on the little translation thing in the seat in front of me and listen to the first 2 acts, emphatically not getting it. And the pleasure there was very much a sensuous pleasure, right? I mean, it was bodily and bodily rather than cognitive. The position of the role of not getting it, the stance of not getting it, is that one which you inhabit when you are writing, when you are seeing patients, not trying to know or to understand? Is that a valuable, a productive stance for you?
Yeah. Can I just, to get to that, say something about
Don Carlo?
Your experience yesterday?
Anything you could say would be illustrative.
What seems to me to be interesting in that is that it's to do with music, even though it's not.
Yeah, right.
And music seems to be a good example of the thing we're talking about, which is that, or what I'm talking about in the book, which is that one of the reasons people might want to get it is to regulate the emotion they might fear being suffused by or overwhelmed by. And I think there are people who can't bear listening to music and people who love music, but what people are able to say about music is always so much more circumscribed than what they feel in the listening to it. And it seems to me music is a good example of this, because you don't get a piece of music in the sense of being able to explain it, but it's felt very intensely in one's body in some sense. And there's something about that seems to me to matter, partly because, of course, it's where one starts with the experiences as a child.
Right.
One doesn't have a capacity of representation, but one does have bodily responses,
right.
which are very immediate. The risk is that what happens, I think, is that that people mother themselves with their minds. That insofar as they're trying to regulate the intensity of what's evoked in them, they will use what they think of as their minds, or we will use what we think of as our minds, as a way of somehow regulating the intensity of feeling through making it intelligible. And that's obviously a very good and necessary thing to do. But by the same token, it preempts certain other experiences that might be as or more valuable. So certainly in psychoanalysis, the idea of evenly hovering attention, suspended, etc., and all that stuff, this is the attempt, I think, to be as receptive as you can be without losing your mind. And by losing your mind, I just mean feeling so anxious you can't bear it. So that the attempt is, the implication is, if you're struggling all the time to work out what the person is on about, you actually won't be able to listen to what they're saying to you. And you won't be able to listen to it. You won't be able to literally take it into your body, because and presumably the reason you're trying not to do that is for fear of what the effect it'll have on you. So it's as though the unconscious assumption is that words are potentially terrifyingly evocative, or bodies that use words are. And so that's being in some way managed. So that I'm aware that the more I am determinedly trying to work out the meaning of what the person says, the more that's happening, the more anxious I am in the session. And then I think, if I'm able to, what could be making me so anxious that I need to work this out? It's almost as though I need, at that moment, some kind of formulation, an interpretation, a clue about what this might be about. And sometimes that's very useful, but sometimes it's entirely preemptive. Because it's as though the unconscious collusion is that me and the person I'm seeing don't want to go on with this. So let's talk instead. And the this can be very, very important.
Could be, for instance, what? The this?
Well, it could be either the evolution of a forbidden feeling, or a feeling that was unknown in its evolution. In other words, not knowing where this is going, not knowing what you might feel as you begin to unconsciously apprehend what you might be about to say. Because people surprise themselves when they talk. And Winnicott says the aim of analysis is to enable the patient to surprise themselves. Well, in order for that to be a good and useful thing, you have to make sure the surprises are not traumatic. And one's prospective view of the dangers of what one might say in this story is related to things one has already experienced and fears their occurrence. So it's almost like an attempt to sort of stop time, or to stop the repetition of the past.
The dangers of what one might say, but also the dangers of what one might hear.
Yes, exactly. But yes, both things, of what one might say and feel in the saying, and the unknownness of the other person's response.
Now, does that then, so the dangers and the possibilities that are there while you are in a session, talking and listening, does that translate into an equivalent set or an analogous set of possibilities when you are writing?
It doesn't actually for me, simply because the writing is done very automatically. So this is an exaggeration, but it's entirely pleasurable for me. In the sense that...
most people can relate to that, I'm sure.
Well, the reason I'm unwilling to talk about this is for precisely that reason. But the actuality of the experience is, it's very easy for me to do. It isn't a struggle. I'm not tormented. I'm not desperately trying to articulate something I can't get to. It has already done itself effectively. So that the thing we're talking about really exists for me in analysis in real life. But in writing it doesn't, for some reason.
Yeah, so how do you understand that?
I don't really understand it. I really don't. Because we were talking about this earlier, but I never had an ambition or a thought to be a writer. It never occurred to me. I wanted to read, and I wanted to be a psychoanalyst. And when I started writing, then I couldn't stop writing. And it was just like that. And of course, it can't be that simple, but I have a limited apprehension of it. I just know the experience of it. And I don't think about it very much. I just do it.
So you've said, I've read before you're saying that writing is something that fairly easy, you don't revise too much, you don't edit, it comes naturally to you, but that by contrast, being a therapist can be quite difficult. And is that what you just described? Is that the nature of the difficulty, this response to this question of tact or need to make sure that you don't close off the possibility of experiences by talking?
Yeah, exactly.
Or by understanding.
Yeah, exactly.
By knowing.
No, that's right. But there's something to me absolutely different between me sitting in a room typing and me in a room with another person. They seem to me to be, my experience of them is that they are completely different experiences. Now, some people would say, well, I am in a room with another person, which is another part of me. But because it doesn't feel alien or persecutory, I don't experience it like that. Whereas with other people, I have the ordinary range of fears, loves, affections, and all that stuff. But it's much more immediate and bodily.
So would it be right to say then that writing, you are absorbed in a way?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what it is. I'm absorbed, and therefore, and in that sense, I don't feel anything, because I forget myself in the doing of it.
Right.
It's a bit like your style is like your smell. You depend on other people to recognize it.
Yeah.
So I'm not sitting there thinking, I must write in my style. Obviously, I just write, and when it works, it is absorbing, and then it
smells
produces
good.
itself. Yeah.
It smells good, right? And other people think that it smells good.
Yeah.
Right. So the I think this is a fair question. I think it's fair because I'm taking it from you. Somewhere you say, I think in this book, you quote Murdoch, Iris Murdoch, saying it's always a good question to ask of a philosopher what it is she said, what it is he fears. So what is it that you fear? I don't mean necessarily, though, feel free to share, you here, but you write in, if that's a true distinction for you. What is your writing fear?
I think my fear is that it won't interest me.
Won't interest you?
I mean, there are certain fears that I fight, if you see what I mean. So, for example, in writing, it's a bit like what Dick Poirier talks about in The Performing Self, in the sense that I think that describes what I feel when I'm doing, which is it's like another way of performing yourself. But in the writing, in my lived life with other people, I might fear being gauche, brash, pretentious, dim, all those things that most of us are familiar with. When I write, I feel like I'm very happy to risk that. I want to have the courage of my gaucheness or my brashness or my naivety. And I feel freer writing to do that. So it's very much like a sort of, it's like a trial action in writing, in a way. Because I think, well, if it sounds good, I'll leave it in. And then if they read it, can tell me whether it is or not. If it's obviously a false note, I would cut it out. And if it's obviously pretentious or spurious or all that stuff. But if there's an ambiguity, but it sounds right, I leave it in. Whereas I'm sure that in my talking, I'm more cautious. Unconsciously, it's not calculated, but I am.
There's a Stanley Cavell, a writer who matters to both of us, has said, sometimes you need to take one step too far to know what the border is, where you should stop. So that's having the courage of risking one's, say, gaucheness or whatever in writing.
Yeah, or one's pretentiousness.
Or certainly pretentiousness.
You pretend to something that may or may not be true, and you find out in the doing of it whether it is.
Right. Either because you read it yourself, or because someone tells you. Yeah. Someone else tells you. You tell yourself or someone else tells you.
Yes, or a part of you has a different view of it than the you you're aware of.
So I would like to change gears a little bit, at least away from, I think we already have, from talking just about your book, to talk some more about writing. Much of the writing you do is a response. We talked about this earlier. You write reviews for the LRB and elsewhere. And I would like to get you to talk about that stance, the stance of responding to other people's writing, and its importance for you. Is it, First, is that true, that responding to others is enabling? And if so, why? Because you could pick and choose. And some of your writing, of course, isn't a review or a response to somebody else, but emerges from someplace else. So I guess this is a question to some extent about the sources of how you begin. How do you begin writing?
I certainly what I like about reviewing is the way in which it begins with an unpredicted demand. I mean, I know I'm going to be offered a book to read, but I don't know what it'll be. So there's something about that crystallizes, I think, sort of unconscious preoccupations. So that's one bit of it. The other bit of it is that I think it's, for me, there's something very pleasurable about the act of appreciating what somebody else does. It's a bit like parenting. I mean, in the sense that this is not meant to be that sentimental, but if someone writes a book, it's a lot of work, and it's very self-exposing, even if it isn't, if you see what I mean. So that, as a reviewer, I want to make a case for what's best about the book. I would only shit on the book if I thought the book was actually pernicious. But otherwise, I would accommodate a lot for the good bits. Because it seems to me it's amazing to be able to write any good bits at all in some ways. And that's what I would want. So I like it gives me pleasure, that act of bringing out the best in a book if I can, but remaining truthful, if you see what I mean, not saying things I know to be false. So there's something like that matters quite a lot. But it's also, the other bit of it, when you asked me the question, was the thought that when I was at university, we were taught that there were writers and there were literary critics. And this was a very different thing. And my experience was not that was the case, that the critics I liked were writers for whom the material was other texts. And so it didn't matter to me what Barthes or Frank Kermode or Richard Poirier or Blackmure were writing about, because I wanted to read their sentences, and their material was other books, but it didn't really matter. So for me, it was much more about, it was as though for those particular writers, doing literary criticism made their voice possible.
So voice. I have one more thing I would like you to talk about before turning things over to the audience for their questions of you and comments and witty remarks. Rereading through your books recently, thinking about talking with you today, it struck me how consistent your style is. And at the end of this question, when I get to it, is going to ask you to comment, to describe your style and to comment on its consistency. There's a moment where you're talking about Freud and on transience. Freud is, Rilke's saying how he can't enjoy the beauty of the world because it's all going to fade. And Freud responds passionately and exclaims, and uses in the essay uses an exclamation mark. And you say, this is unusual for Freud to use an exclamation mark. And I thought, Jesus, Adam Phillips has written 17 books, and there's not one exclamation mark. And that, well, no, I did not go back and check. But it seemed to be possible that key was broken on your computer. And then there was a moment here where you are talking about a hilarious moment where you're talking about Lear, and you imagine Lear as a pragmatist. And you say, he could say to Cordelia, okay, so you don't like the way that the question was phrased? Rephrase the question in a way that's useful for you, and then give me an answer. Which I thought was hilarious. And I thought, oh, actually, Adam Phillips doesn't do funny. He does witty. He's witty all the time. But unless I'm not getting it, of course, I thought, oh, he's not funny that often. So that made me think about what your tone. Let me put it that way. What your tone is like, and what you thought of it. So how would you describe the tone of your writing, and how do you understand its consistency?
I really find it very difficult to answer this, because I find it very difficult to read myself as myself. I mean, if you said to me, asked me the similar question about, say, Christopher Isherwood or Henry James, I would be able to make a stab at an answer. And obviously, I'll make a stab at this question. But I do have a very, very strong sense of when what I write works for me and when it doesn't.
Yeah.
I don't know what the criteria are, and maybe one could infer them, but I don't need to, because it's a thing I just know. I think I know the things I don't want to be, which isn't to say that I'm not them, but
right.
my intention is not to rant, not to be dogmatic, and not to humiliate anybody, including myself. So those are the kind of moral guidelines here. I want, insofar as I want something for the reader, I must want lots of things to the reader, but I don't think about it like that. I want the reader to enjoy the experience of reading it, and within it have their own thoughts, rather than come away with what my theories about X, Y, and Z are. I don't find that interesting, partly because I don't like writing that's like that. I like writing that's, in a certain sense, isn't the right word, but that's hospitable, that allows you to think within it, or that is a pretext for you having your own thoughts and feelings. It's Paeterian in a way.
Yes, indeed.
And I love that. That works for me. So that I want the books to be at once gripping, pleasurable, and completely forgettable in the reading of them. So you wouldn't have to follow them in that sense. So obviously you've got to follow a bit of it, but broadly speaking, you don't have to follow them that much. And you would find, for indiscernible reasons, that it was a pleasure reading them. It would be something like that. And also that there would be, because as everybody notices, including me, there are lots of sort of aphorisms in this thing.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sitting there thinking, well, how can I dream of an aphorism? But it presents itself to me in these ways. And sometimes I'm thrilled and sometimes I'm not. But this is how it presents itself. Now, if I think, well, why would I want to write aphorisms? And I think about the aphorisms that I like. And some of the writers I like are aphoristic. I think that in writing aphorisms, it's like a sort of plea for sympathy in some way. It's like wanting to make a group that isn't a cult. So some will go, yes, or they'll go, no. But something definitive will have happened in that moment. So that's the moment when you can't hover, when you can't be vague. And then the rest of it you can be vague about. So I think it's a bit like that. That's one bit of it. And I want it to be, even though I really don't like the word, elegant. But I'm stuck with that.
All right. I've been told to ask you, when you come to make comments or questions of Adam, to please use the microphones. Shy though you may be, nonetheless, it would help all of us out if you would come up to the microphone and ask from it. Thank you for setting an example.
I've been told to ask a question by Ellen, so I will. This has to do with accepting one's life as it is and the relationship to stoicism. And I'm curious how you regard your relationship to stoicism, how you regard Freud's relationship to stoicism, and whether it connects to Nietzsche's amor fati, that whole idea of loving one's fate. And if indeed is stoicism a practicable goal?
That's quite a big question. I think two things about Freud and me in relation to this question. That there is something genuinely noble and morally impressive about the willingness to endure without cynicism some of the suffering that one's life inevitably involves. But to me, the more interesting thing that Freud writes about is masochism. And I think where Stoicism shades into masochism is where this gets really interesting. Because I think Freud is saying, or I'm making Freud say, that the best and worst thing about us is that we can make pain pleasurable. It's necessary in order to survive. But the problem is then we get addicted to the pleasure that is pain. And it preempts our capacity for better satisfactions. So I think that there's a risk, and Freud, of course, alerts us to this in a way Nietzsche does too, that we might wonder about the way we constitute our virtues or what they're made out of. So if, for example, Stoicism is made out of masochism, then it is both tyrannical and self-defeating. It's a way of guaranteeing a frustration. So I think in a way, and this is again, it's like the trilling point about the bit of ourselves that can't adapt. That there are at least two currents in Freud. One current says you need to adapt to the world you're living because there isn't another world. And the other current says you've got to make a world in which your desire can live more fully. The risk is that in being stoical, one will be over-adapted and lose vitality. And even though I know this is a very old-fashioned way of speaking, I still believe in it. I still believe the question is, what in any relationship, how much vitality you have to sacrifice in order to sustain the relationship, and that being kind of very, very important. So I think Freud offers a stoical ideal and offers us the tools to undo it, or wonder about it, or think about it.
That was great, thank you. There's a lot of work in neuroscience that examines some of the issues that you touch on in your books, and I'm wondering, is that of interest to you? Are you influenced by that? How you look at that?
It's of absolutely no interest to me at all. And I don't mean by that I think it isn't true, because a lot of it sounds as though it is true, although I wouldn't know. But I'm absolutely unmoved by the sentences of neuroscience. It just doesn't move me at all. I also think, but this is a more ignorant point, I think, even than the previous one, that there is a real risk, certainly in psychoanalysis, and it may be true in the larger culture, that everybody's sort of sitting around waiting for neuroscientists to tell us the truth about who we are. And I don't mind anybody joining in the conversation, but I don't think they should be the new philosopher kings. And I just find brains very, very uninteresting. That's all I can say. And I know this is moronic, but nevertheless, it is actually what I think.
It's brainless.
Exactly. And I think that in states of real distress, in ordinary states of catastrophic distress, I don't think knowing how my brain is working is going to help me. I'd rather have a conversation, but that's a question of choice.
So actually, let me follow that up a bit. Some people might say, a person in some positions might say, oh, I'm interested in this topic, and here are these people in a related field, neuroscience, and they're interested in something quite close to it, but they're speaking about it very differently. I have a responsibility to come to terms with what they are saying, interested in it or not.
You see, for me, I don't mean that for you or for anybody else, but for me that would be like fake liberalism. You see, I know that I'm supposed to be interested in the things that I disagree with. But a lot of things I disagree with, I'm not interested in, actually. Mm-hmm. Now, that may be to my cost, and I will then discover that. Mm-hmm. But it would be totally phony for me to start thinking, okay, I'll talk to some neuroscientists.
But 30 minutes ago, you said, well, the thing I like about reviewing is these things come to you packed with surprises.
I know, but I have to take my chances here. Mm. I mean, of course, I could meet a neuroscientist. You see, if I met a neuroscientist that I really liked as a person, then yeah. I definitely could have the conversation you're hoping I will have. And I haven't yet. I could. And unfortunately, I've met very few. But every so often, like everybody else who's sort of interested in, the meaning of life, I go to the section in bookshops and I leaf through these books. And I never buy one. Mm. And I never buy them because actually there are so many other books I'd rather read. I mean, if the choice, and of course it isn't like this, if the choice was between reading Wallace Stevens and reading Steven Pinker, there would just be no choice. And that's to do with, it's probably entirely a function of my education, but it is my education.
I wanted to ask you about what's the state of Sigmund Freud in the field of psychology today. It seems to me in the 1950s there was a terrific more interest in him, and yet while perhaps he's declined within the field of psychology, he's strong as ever in cultural studies and in other related fields.
It's difficult to comment because I'm just wary of making sort of panoramic, universal comments about disciplines and countries and all that stuff, because I just don't know enough. But my impression of it is this. First of all, I don't know if it's true here, but in England there's a difference between psychology and psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is a branch of psychology, but there's a whole huge discipline of psychology in Britain, which is scientific psychology. Well, in scientific psychology, as far as I know, Freud has never been taken as of any interest. So that's almost always been the case. My sense of it is that Freud, like a lot of other writers, is still very much alive for some people, and for lots of people he is of no interest. Certainly, I think for people who want to live their lives and their sensibilities by scientific criteria, Freud certainly will be redundant, because he's not a scientist. But as a writer, he's really quite promising, I think.
He's got a future?
He's got a future. And I think he'll get more of a future from people not being interested in him. Because what it'll mean is that only people who have a passion for it will read it, hopefully. It'll be like poetry in that regard. There'll be no glamour, no money, no cultural prestige in going into that stuff. So you'll only do it if you loved it. And that'll revitalize the profession. Because when psychoanalysis was very fashionable, in a way it was killed by its fashionableness. Because it then made promises, both to its practitioners, to its patients, that it couldn't possibly keep. And hopefully it'll become a different thing. It'll be picked up by people who are interested in a different way. That's my wish, anyway.
You said that as a reviewer, you only shit on a book if it's pernicious. And I'm curious what that means for a book to be pernicious.
Well, for me it would mean that it was actually, it contained within it the intent to humiliate or scapegoat or demonize, broadly speaking. But there could be tones that were blander versions of that were sort of snide or mildly contemptuous that I also wouldn't probably like. But that wouldn't be true across the board, I think. I mean, if, for example, I reviewed a book that was manifestly anti-Semitic, it would be difficult for me to simply ironize that. I mean, I reviewed a book recently by a man called Roger Scruton. Unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the book. But the book was pretty unpleasant, and in many ways I thought unpublishable. This was a book about... it's called My Church, and it's about basically Anglicanism. And the book, as far as I could see in reading it, was basically saying Anglicanism is a wonderful, superior faith, and the people who aren't in it have no idea what they're missing. And then you go to the footnotes, of course, and it says things like, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm not caricaturing. It says things like, is homosexuality more of a sin than marital infidelity? And you think, what? And obviously I don't mind people who like speaking like that reading that stuff. I mean, that's up to them. But we're being offered here a book about the value of a certain kind of faith. Well, if the faith has in it, sustains in it ideas like that, I want to be able to say why I think they're terrible. But in reviewing the book, I felt I couldn't work out whether it better to just turn the book down or to engage with it and say the things about it I thought were no good. But it was ambiguous. It really was.
Thank
you. You said very interestingly that when you write, as opposed to speak to somebody or in session, but in general, that you lose yourself in it, get absorbed by it, and so in one sense you're more unself-consciously expressive when you write, rather than. But it's an interesting thing, just an odd thing to. I mean, I realize you were speaking for yourself and not saying anything general, but it's an interesting thing. As a rule, I think, but I could be wrong about this, but my instinct is that as a rule, from the point of view of the reader rather than the hearer, the reader takes writing to be less expressive because, you know, the voice and the breath and so on are not there. It's just on a page. And whereas a hearer sort of senses the expressiveness because of the voice and breath and so on. So there's a sort of interesting asymmetry here. From the point of view of the writer, in your case, let's say, there's more expressiveness because you...
I wouldn't claim greater expressiveness. I would think of these things as different. I mean, in writing, I take heart in something John Ashbery said in an interview, where somebody said to him, why is your poetry so difficult? And he said, well, I noticed that when you want to talk to people, they lose interest in what you're saying. When you talk to yourself, they want to listen in. And I think that's a good picture, certainly for me anyway, of writing. So that's what I'm doing. When I practice psychoanalysis, it's not that I don't forget myself, because of course I do, but I'm trained to and believe in moving between being completely absorbed in the conversation and being aware of what else is going on in my mind. And so I'm perfectly able to within the confines of the genre of psychoanalysis, express myself. Indeed, it frees me to express myself in certain ways that I can't in other places, which is one of the reasons I love doing it. But it's not more or less expressive. It's expressive in different ways, and they're different freedoms. But I certainly couldn't say I'm freer in one place than the other, because they're different.
And you don't think that the reader, as opposed to the hearer, tends to think, well, this person's had a lot of time to figure things out. It becomes more detached from him, this less self-consciousness. So he's sort of not getting the kind of absorption you have just because it's on the page and not spoken. You don't get any sense of an asymmetry here between the sorts of things you were describing as a writer, but the reader is bound not to think of it that way because what he or she gets is on a page.
I can see that, but in a way, I could say to you, I don't care about the reader. I mean, I hope the reader will vote with their feet or their eyes and their ears. That's to say, they'll either want to read this or they won't. It's like a joke in that sense. You either get it or you don't. I'm not consciously, although I must be doing this unconsciously, I'm not consciously trying to seduce and lull and coax people to read my books.
Right.
What I consciously am doing is I'm writing them, and then it's take it or leave it. It can't be that ruthless, but that's what I want to believe.
So I'm not great at questions, but I think I'm asking for practical advice, really. I did my dissertation on E. Cummings and burlesque and Crazy Cat and you and Winnicott, and I found that in doing that and in writing fiction, when I am absorbed and forget myself, then yes, like that's when it works. But the idea of I get violently flung out from that and then everything goes wrong.
Yeah.
And the idea of having to work hard at not working and what you're relying on when you do that, whether it's some kind of faith in something, I don't know how to work on not working.
No, but I mean, it's a good question because in a way, certainly for me anyway, one of the things you do in psychoanalysis is you analyze people's resistance to forgetting themselves. That it's actually about facilitating people's capacity for absorption, and by the same token, noticing the ways in which unconsciously they sabotage that absorption because there is a fear or risk attached to it. So that in a way, what you're describing is exactly what happens in an analysis, or the kind of analysis I do, in the sense, and there's not a suggestion you should have analysis, but that insofar as people find that their attention is waylaid or sabotaged or interrupted, then I would be trying to work out in a conversation with them what they fear would happen if it wasn't interrupted or waylaid. So, for example, somebody could fear that they will never come back from their absorption in something, or it might give them a pleasure they feel is overwhelming, or they might fear that if it's pleasurable, they may never be able to recover it. I mean, there are a lot of possibilities, but that would be the kind of conversation I would be having, that there would be a real reason why one was regulating one's absorption.
Did you say your dissertation was on Crazy Cat in addition to E. Cummings and Adam Phillips? Yeah. What a great, and Winnicott. What a great thing.
It's a natural group, I think.
Yes, right.
Hi, my question is, what is the difference between envy and imagining yourself in another world that you can't, or imagining another world that you can't have? And does the word envy come up in any of your thinking?
It does, because it's integral to the psychoanalytic training I had above anything else. But I assume that in envy, there is the wish to spoil the thing you want or feel entitled to but can't have. So the envious imagining of other lives is, I think, the attempt to create a world in which those things don't exist so you don't have to envy them. Whereas you can use other lives as a way of imagining one's own possibilities that is not a spoiling. So the envious thing is an attack.
Does it stand in relationship to sympathy?
Yes, I think it does, because I think that envy is an attack on one's capacity for sympathy, in the sense that there is a determination not to be sympathetic, because it would mean you having to acknowledge what you were deprived of. You see what I mean? in order to be sympathetic, you have to imagine what somebody else is feeling.
Yes.
In some sense. Now, if you feel yourself deprived of the capacity to feel that, you may just want to rubbish the whole thing or abolish it.
But in both cases, you're imagining yourself, or you are failing to imagine yourself inhabiting that other.
Yeah, you're making
place.
a world in which there'll be nothing you want that you can't have.
Yeah.
So I'll just say a biographical fact about Freud, and you can tell me what you think it has to do with psychoanalysis as such, which is that he had a prodigious photographic memory, or the anecdote I know is that the introductory lectures were delivered extemporaneously, and then that he wrote them down afterwards, and that's the book that we have, which to me is crazy. And also, I learned rather late in learning about psychoanalysis that he didn't write anything down in the sessions, and of course, we have these extensive case histories about this, and maybe that's just how it is. But I was wondering if that had anything to do in terms of writing, the kind of conversation that you're having. Certainly that would make a difference to have the world's greatest memory, and just write down speeches that you delivered extemporaneously, but also in terms of practice, what that has to do.
Well, the thing about not taking notes is important in this, because in not taking notes, it's like a commitment to the unconscious metabolism of the experience of the conversation. So the risk is, if you take notes, you make a documentary out of the session. Whereas what might be very important is what you unconsciously cook from the session and then find yourself remembering, and when you do in fact remember it. So that I think the logic, even if you don't agree with it, the logic of not taking notes is that to take notes would be to preempt an unconscious memory with a conscious set of formulae. And Freud is very interested in what he calls dream work, which is effectively the idiosyncratic individual's metabolism of their experience, their digestion of their experience, and what they're using it to do unwittingly. I think the thing about, it's very hard in a way that Freud makes very clear to make deductions about what people who are dead did and what their lives were like, what they were really like. And one of the reasons Freud was skeptical of biography was because he saw it as a kind of antitype to analysis. Because in analysis, obviously, the patient can answer back, whereas the biographer mostly is writing of people who can't answer back. And Freud says, he doesn't say this, but I'm making him say this. Freud says, the worst thing we ever do is speak on somebody else's behalf. And analysis was invented so that people could speak on their own behalf, and to show them the ways in which it's very, very difficult to speak on your own behalf. Because when you speak on your own behalf, you're always speaking on lots of other people's behalf as well. But at least it makes that an object to be considered. So Freud really does not believe in biography. He thinks it's a very misleading fiction. It's like a biography of him is like a poor novel.
So this is a rather general question, but if, as you said at the beginning, we all live our lives through comparison with other people, then how do we know which life is ours? Where do we draw the lines?
Good question. You see, I think in a way that's the point, which is that put like that, it's very clear that we can't know in any absolute sense. But all we can be aware of is of some ways of being ourselves that feel against the grain or shameful. Well, it doesn't mean we don't want to be them, but it means that's what we feel when we do. And it may be that what you've described is what we're always working out. It could never be resolved, but we're presumably trying to find ways of living with sufficient satisfaction to make our lives feel worth living, and doing what's necessary to do that.
So just one more tiny question.
Yeah,
so
do.
if someone goes for analysis because they're trying to find the right kind of life for them, isn't there a danger that they're going to live a life which is a version by their analyst?
Yeah, no, there's a real risk of that. But in good analysis, you see, let's imagine you're not you, but you're a person who has that fear. That might be one of the things that would be analyzed, which is, I might say to this person, given you bring this fear to analysis, I wonder if, and it would be put tentatively, obviously, your fear is that when you engage in a relationship with somebody, they're very likely to take you over. So you'll end up not knowing what you want, or whether you're simply wanting what they want you to want. Well, that's exactly the kind of question that everybody suffers from, and that analysis is invented to talk about. Not how can you find your real self, because that's fruitless. But you can find you can find ways of being that are more or less satisfying to yourself, more or less self-betraying.
Hi there. I was interested in the case of Professor Miller's graduate student who thought he might like to be a child psychoanalyst on hearing the story about the clothing. I thought that sat very interestingly with what you said about the difference between the way you feel when you're psychoanalyzing someone and when you're writing. And I wondered, I mean, I'm kind of with you. I think I would be much more fearful of being a psychoanalyst because of the pressure of time that you described, the way you have to pick one of your ideas and go with that one, and also the ethical burden, of course. So I just wondered how you might react to this graduate student, how you might understand his desire, what you might ask him.
Well, I assume that anybody who wants to be a psychoanalyst, just as anybody who wants to be an accountant, has reasons of which they are unconscious for what they want to do. But that one of the reasons is it's an attempt at a self-cure for something. So if somebody says, I'd really like to be a psychoanalyst, I would say, well, the first thing you should do is have some psychoanalysis to find out what it's like. Just that. Not with the insidious assumption that you're obviously doing it for all sorts of other reasons, because I don't know that either. But what I do know is that the only way you can find out about it is by doing it. Reading the books doesn't do it. You get something very, very interesting from reading the books, but it's different from actually, as it were, undergoing it. But I think it's a bit like the thing that Robert Stoller once said, which he was a psychoanalyst, American psychoanalyst, who did a lot of work with transgender people and transvestites and so on. And he said once at a conference to psychoanalysts, which was a very, very bold thing to say in those days and probably still, he said, the question isn't why is he a transvestite, the question is why aren't I a transvestite? And it is a better question. If somebody wants to be a psychoanalyst, there are two questions. One is, why doesn't everybody want to be a psychoanalyst? And why does this particular person want to be one? In other words, what does it represent at that moment that has really gripped somebody? And one of the ways you can find that out is by doing it. So anybody who's interested, anybody who was curious, I would say, try it. I wouldn't say, it's fabulous, you really should do it. Or it's a really incredible life, even though for me it has been that. But I would say, find out. But follow your curiosity. And if you have a moment like that, where you read something, you think, God, then you should pursue it and see.
I heard you speak earlier today during an interview about frustration, and I may be too small for it, but I'm curious about your comments about frustration, the potential uses of frustration, and I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
The only reason I'm hesitating is because I feel like I've been talking about this for so long because of this book. But the basic idea in the book, as I remember it, is that, and this does seem to me to be interesting, which is that the worst thing you can be frustrated of is frustration, because in states of frustration you have the possibility of finding out what it is you might want, of imagining and thinking. So the risk is of being fobbed off with more instant forms of gratification. So I'm suggesting that frustration, that we, somebody who's interested, including me, needs to make as attractive and alluring a case for frustration as a state of mind. That will be a way of persuading people not to be phobic of it. Because it seems to be obvious that capitalism depends upon people being frightened of states of frustration. And we're being fobbed off, and we are fobbing ourselves off. So it's really about saying, if you want something, sometimes it is better to wait for it. And in that waiting, you will begin to elaborate it and imagine it. You might get more of a sense of what your desire is. Whereas if you preempt it, if every time I feel sort of slightly restless and bored, I eat something, I will never find out what I might have wanted. Now, the risk of finding out what you want is obvious, which is that it may not be available. So there are very good reasons why nobody wants to find out what they do really want. But I think they're not as good as the reason to find out what you want.
I spent 5 fairly miserable years in psychoanalysis 3 times a week. And I remember saying to my therapist many times, if only I could sit here in silence for an hour, I feel like I would be cured, but I can't. Several years later, I figured out that I could actually sit in silence for an hour by myself or with other people, and discovered meditation. And it sort of seems to answer a lot of the doubts and fears I've had about therapy and skepticism about therapy. And I'm just wondering if you're interested in that, if the subject of meditation interests you, and the idea that you would sit with whatever comes up without talking about it, without making a note about it, without sort of describing it.
No, I would certainly do that. I would, if somebody thought, it's a bit like the last one question, you see, I sort of think, if somebody begins to think that meditation is just what they need, they should find out. So I would encourage that, unless I thought it was actively self-destructive. But I wouldn't then speak in some authoritative, oracular way about it being self-destructive. I would just offer it as a possibility. But I certainly wouldn't. I think there's something very precious about analysis, about psychoanalysts either implying or being explicit about the idea that really analysis is the thing. Well, really, analysis in a way should make it possible for you to use the cultural field you live in. So it should actually free you if, for example, you think, I'd like to try meditation, to try meditation and find out. It should be on the side of an experimental life, not on a foreclosed life in which, it's as though the analyst or you and the analyst already know what's good for you. Because the big difference between children and adults is that adults have to know what's good for children. They have to, because they're protecting their future selves. Whereas actually no adult can legitimately, morally know what's best for another adult, I think. And in analysis, you have to have it both ways. The analyst has to both be, without being a patronizing version of this, akin to a figure who might know what's in a person's best interests, and also absolutely allow for the fact that only they know what's in their best interests. So I would say meditate or sit in silence or whatever.
I was wondering why, in your opinion...
I'm sorry, could you move up a little bit and tilt? Thank you.
I was wondering why, in your opinion, so much of contemporary art is quote-unquote conceptual. It almost leads you to the get it. It's very didactic almost in that regard. And that preempts that notion that you were saying about the thinking within. So when you're talking about when someone reads your books, you want them to be thinking within. I was wondering if you have an idea of why that is, why there's that current.
I don't really have ideas about large things